My fiancé's mother slid a folder across the table in front of 60 guests and said the words loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. Sign it. Gold digger. You bring nothing to this family. 60 conversations stopped at once. I could hear the string quartet still playing somewhere behind me, completely out of sync with the silence at our table. Picked up the pen. My hand was steady, which surprised even me. I opened my own folder. And my father-in-law, a man who had built an entire company out of nothing and rarely looked rattled by anything, went completely still. I'm going to walk you through exactly how we got to that table. Not just the dinner. All of it. 12 moments spread across 2.5 years, that each quietly rewrote what this story actually was, without me even realizing it was happening in real time. I need you to believe for most of this video, exactly what that family believed about me. Because for a long time so did I. Stay until the end because the person who stood up from that table was not the person who sat down. Before I tell you about Daniel, I need you to understand who I actually was at 26. I grew up in a house where money was a constant, quiet stress. Not dramatic poverty, just the kind of tight, exhausting math that never let up. My mom worked 2 jobs most of my childhood. My dad left when I was 9, and what little he sent stopped completely by the time I was 13. I got a partial scholarship to a decent state school, took out loans for the rest, and graduated with a business degree and $40,000 of debt that felt at the time like a life sentence. I moved to the city with 2 roommates I found on a group chat and took the first stable job I could find. A coffee shop on a busy corner downtown, 6 a.m. shifts, tips that barely covered a third of my monthly loan payment. I picked up a second job on weekends doing administrative work for a small logistics broker, mostly data entry, nothing glamorous. I was tired in a way that had become so normal I stopped noticing it. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I had 2 good friends, a decent apartment, and a stubborn private belief that I was capable of more than my bank account currently reflected. But I also understood, the way anyone with debt and no safety net understands, that stability wasn't a given. It was something you built for yourself slowly, carefully, with no room for mistakes. That was the version of me sitting behind the counter on a Tuesday morning in March, when a man in a slightly too formal suit walked in looking lost, glanced at the menu board like it was written in another language, and asked me what I'd actually recommend. His name was Daniel. He was there for a wedding across the street and had almost an hour to kill. I told him the seasonal blend was overrated and the plain drip was underrated, and he laughed harder than the joke deserved. He stayed 40 minutes past his coffee. He asked real questions, not small talk questions. What did I want to be doing in 5 years? What made me pick this city? I gave him honest, slightly guarded answers, because giving strangers real answers wasn't something I did often. He left his number on a napkin, which felt like something out of a movie I would have rolled my eyes at if it happened to someone else. Here's the part that matters, though, the part one didn't understand until much later. The woman he met that morning was 3 weeks away from a decision that would completely restructure her life. He fell for someone who was already, quietly, becoming a different person, and neither of us had any idea yet. 3 weeks after that first coffee, 2 former classmates from my business program reached out. We'd built a rough prototype together over a year of nights and weekends, a supply chain platform meant to help small retailers avoid the kind of inventory disasters I'd watched crush small businesses firsthand during my data entry job. They'd gotten early interest from an accelerator program and wanted to go all in. They asked if I'd join full-time. I said yes before I let myself fully think it through because some part of me knew that if I thought it through, fear would win. I gave notice at both jobs within the same week. I told Daniel, who I'd been seeing for about a month by then, that I was figuring some things out, doing some freelance consulting. Technically true. Meaningfully incomplete. I told my roommates the real version. I told Daniel a softened one. And when, a few weeks later, he asked if I wanted to meet his parents, I said yes, still carrying that softened version with me, because the truth felt too fragile and too uncertain to hand to strangers, let alone strangers who mattered. Daniel's family lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house that didn't scream money so much as murmur it constantly. In the landscaping, in the car, in the driveway, in the quiet, expensive plainness of everything. His father, Richard, had built a logistics company from a single leased warehouse in the early 80s into a business now worth tens of millions. His mother, Elaine, had stopped working entirely after Daniel's oldest sister was born, and had spent the following 3 decades perfecting the art of a certain kind of social ease that only comes from never once worrying about money. Daniel had 2 older sisters, both married into families that fit, in Elaine's words, well. Doctors, a hedge fund analyst, people whose parents already knew Richard and Elaine socially before the weddings ever happened. Daniel was the youngest, the one who'd studied something impractical in college and taken his time finding his footing, and now apparently was dating a coffee shop employee with visible debt and no savings account worth mentioning. I felt the assessment happen within the first 10 minutes of that first dinner. Elaine's eyes moved from my shoes to my bag to my hands in a pattern so practiced it barely registered as rude to her. Just habit. Richard was warmer on the surface but asked, almost immediately, what my 5-year plan was, in a tone that made clear he already suspected the answer would disappoint him. I answered honestly in the vaguest way honesty allows. I told them I was doing consulting work while I figured out my next move. I watched Richard's expression settle into something between polite and unconvinced. I watched Elaine's mouth do a small, tight thing that wasn't quite a smile. That dinner could have gone differently. I could have told them right there about the prototype, the late nights, the small but real client interest we'd already started generating. Instead, I chose the version of myself that felt safer to hand over, the quiet, modest, slightly uncertain woman who wouldn't threaten anything or invite further scrutiny. That single choice, made in the first 30 minutes of knowing this family, became the shape of the next 2.5 years. I let the assumption stand because correcting it felt riskier than confirming it. I didn't know yet how expensive that decision would eventually get. 8 months into building the company, we landed our first real client, a regional hardware chain willing to pilot our platform across 12 locations for a 6-figure annual contract. I remember exactly where I was standing in our cramped 3-desk office when the email confirmation came through. I called Daniel immediately, giddy in a way I rarely let myself be. Work is going really well, I told him. That was the entire update he got. He said that was great, genuinely happy for me, and then asked if I wanted to come to dinner with his parents that weekend, since his mother had been asking about me. I said yes to the dinner. I said nothing further about the client. Looking back, this is the exact point where my life quietly split into 2 separate parallel tracks, one where I was becoming someone increasingly capable and successful, and one where I remained, in the eyes of the people who mattered to my future, a coffee shop girl doing vague freelance work. I was the only person alive who could see both tracks running at once, and for a long time I told myself that was fine. By month 11, things had accelerated faster than any of us expected. A mid-size investment group focused on logistics and supply chain technology reached out about a potential partnership, interested enough to schedule a formal call. My co-founder Priya joked afterward that I should buy a better car so people stop assuming we're broke. A joke that landed harder than she knew, because I drove the same car I'd had since college, the same car I'd parked 2 blocks from Daniel's parents' house so it wouldn't be visible from their driveway. That same week, Elaine asked, during a dress-fitting appointment for my sister-in-law's baby shower, whether my family would be contributing anything at all to the wedding costs, since Richard and Elaine were covering the venue, catering, and most of the guest list. I gave a small, apologetic answer about my family's limited means, which was true of my mother, but increasingly quietly untrue of me. I sat in my car outside their house for 4 full minutes after that conversation before I could make myself drive away. That's the moment I first understood how strange this double life had actually become, and how much stranger it was going to get before anyone else knew the truth. For months before the wedding, the paperwork came through. A formal independent valuation firm, brought in as part of the investment group's due diligence, valued the company at just over $27 million. My personal equity stake, after 2 rounds of dilution and everything Priya, our third co-founder Marcus, and I had built together, came out to just over $11 million on paper. I sat alone in our office, everyone else already gone for the evening, and read that number 3 separate times, as if it might change or explain itself further on a 4th read. It didn't. It just sat there on the page, enormous and strange in mine. I didn't call Daniel first. I didn't call anyone first, actually. I sat in that quiet office for almost an hour, and I want to be honest about something uncomfortable because it matters for what comes later. Some part of me had already started, almost involuntarily, rehearsing who I would eventually tell, and in what order, and I noticed that Daniel's parents were nowhere near the top of that mental list. I told myself that was just prioritization. Looking back, I think it was something closer to a decision I hadn't consciously made yet, but had already started living inside of. I told Daniel 2 days later, over dinner at our apartment, in a conversation that felt strangely small for the size of the news. He was thrilled, hugged me, asked good questions about what it meant practically. I gave him real numbers this time, real detail, more than I'd given him in 11 months combined. But I still asked him that same night, not to mention it to his parents yet. I told him I wanted to sit with it privately for a little while longer. He agreed easily without pushing. I remember feeling relieved by how easily he agreed, and I also remember faintly, a small discomfort I didn't examine closely enough at the time, that keeping a secret this large had become so normal between us that neither of us thought to question it anymore. Here is where the story I understood and the story that was actually unfolding start to diverge in ways I had no visibility into at all. Around this same period, roughly 5 months before the wedding, Richard had grown quietly uneasy about me in a way that had nothing to do with anything I'd actually done. It wasn't one incident. It was an accumulation, a gap between the woman his son described with obvious devotion and the woman Richard and Elaine had spent 2 years quietly cataloging as underwhelming, evasive, and financially unstable. Richard, a man who built an entire company on due diligence and risk assessment, decided to apply the same instincts to his future daughter-in-law. He hired an accountant, a family friend who owed him a favor, to quietly run a basic financial background check. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive by any technical definition, just the kind of check any sufficiently paranoid, wealthy family might run before a wedding. What came back confused him more than it clarified anything. There were large, unexplained deposits inconsistent with any visible employment. There was no clear employer on record at all for the past year. There was no debt paydown pattern that made sense against the income the credit profile implied. To Richard, trained to read financial irregularity as a warning sign rather than good fortune, this read like exactly one thing. A woman hiding something, possibly a scam, possibly hidden debt she disguised, possibly something worse he hadn't even guessed at yet. He was looking directly at $11 million of extraordinary good news, and reading it as a threat, because the story he'd already built about me in his head had no room left for a version where I simply, quietly succeeded. Convinced he'd uncovered something genuinely dangerous, Richard didn't come to me. He didn't come to Daniel either. He went straight to the family's longtime attorney and had a prenuptial agreement drafted, one built not around the standard, reasonable protections a family in his position might request, but around something closer to a financial firewall, entitling me to almost nothing in the event of a divorce, regardless of the marriage's length, regardless of anything Daniel and I might build together afterward. He told Elaine his theory. She, already primed by 2 years of quiet suspicion, didn't question it, she amplified it. Together they decided not to raise it privately with either of us beforehand, worried, in Richard's words later, that she'd have time to prepare an explanation. Instead, they settled on the rehearsal dinner in front of 60 witnesses, as the moment with the most leverage, the least room for me to maneuver, and the highest likelihood in their minds of forcing an honest reaction out of me. In the 6 weeks leading up to the wedding, Elaine's questions changed in tone. Less about centerpieces and seating charts, more pointed, more frequent, more specifically about money. She asked more than once whether I had much put away realistically. She asked whether I understood how these arrangements typically work in families like ours. I answered every question the same way I always had, vaguely, deflecting gently, protecting a secret that had, by this point, grown enormous. What I didn't understand yet was that she wasn't fishing anymore. She'd seen the background check results. She wasn't testing a theory. She believed she already had her answer, and every vague, evasive response I gave only confirmed it further in her mind. I was, without realizing it, actively feeding the exact narrative that would explode across that rehearsal dinner table. The night arrived. String lights strung across a private outdoor dining room, 60 guests, a menu Elaine had spent months finalizing. Richard stood, tapped his glass, and began a toast about protecting what matters and protecting family legacies. A toast that, in hindsight, several guests later admitted had struck them as oddly specific for a wedding rehearsal. Then Elaine reached under the table and placed the folder in front of me. Inside was the prenuptial agreement. She slid a pen across the table alongside it, and said the words that stopped every conversation in that room at once. "Sign it. Gold digger." You bring nothing to this family. I felt 60 pairs of eyes shift toward me. I felt Daniel go rigid beside me, his mouth opening in obvious, genuine shock, clearly as blindsided as I was. I felt 2.5 years of small, accumulated dismissals arrive at their destination all at once, in front of an audience. Picked up the pen. This is the exact moment where everything you've believed about me up to now was still true. I was quiet. I was modest. I had let this family underestimate me completely. For over 2 years without correction. That was the last second any of that remained true. I set the pen down without signing anything. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I'd been carrying unopened for nearly 3 weeks, because some quiet, cautious part of me had sensed this exact kind of ambush might be coming, even before I understood why. Inside was the independent equity valuation, the signed term sheet from the investment round, and a letter on official firm letterhead, confirming an ownership stake worth more than double the number their family attorney had spent the earlier part of the evening quietly, proudly quoting to a cousin at the far end of the table. I placed it in front of Richard, not Elaine, because he was the one who'd actually built something from nothing and would understand, immediately and completely, exactly what he was looking at. I watched his expression move through 3 distinct stages in the space of about 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something close to fear, the specific fear of a man realizing he'd misjudged a threat entirely and had just humiliated the wrong person in front of everyone whose opinion he'd spent his whole life curating. Elaine picked up the paper next. I watched her read the same numbers 3 times, as though rereading them might eventually change what they said. They didn't. Then Daniel turned to me and asked the question that hurt far more than anything his parents had said all night. You knew? This whole time, and you never told me the full amount. I had told him about the valuation for months earlier in our apartment. What he was really asking, I understood, was why I'd let his family go this far without stopping it. And that was a fair question. I didn't have a fully clean answer for it yet. Here is the turn nobody at that table saw coming, including me, until I said it out loud in front of 60 people. I told them the money had never actually been the point of any of this. I could have shown Richard that folder a year earlier and ended every quiet dismissal instantly. I chose not to because somewhere along the way, without fully admitting it to myself, I'd started running a kind of test. I wanted to know if any of them, including Daniel, would ever value me without needing that folder as proof. The answer, sitting right there in the silence of that room, was no. Not Elaine, who called me a gold digger with zero evidence, based entirely on assumption. Not Richard, who ran a secret background check instead of simply asking me a direct question. And harder to admit, not even Daniel, who loved me sincerely, but who had never once felt the need to push past the soft, incomplete version of me I kept offering him, because the incomplete version was easier and comfortable enough to love. I didn't storm out. I closed the folder calmly, thanked the restaurant staff on my way past the kitchen, and left before dessert was served. The wedding didn't happen on the original schedule. Daniel and I spent the following month having the conversation we should have had 2.5 years earlier, about what it actually means to build a life with someone who never once asked to see your whole picture, because the incomplete one was simply easier to hold. We're still together. I want to be honest about that, because a clean, dramatic ending where I walked away forever would make for an easier story, but it wouldn't be the true one. What genuinely changed was Daniel, for the first time in his life, standing up to his parents directly with one sentence. That if they ever spoke to me that way again, they would not be part of whatever we built next, wedding or no wedding. Richard and Elaine never apologized directly, not in so many words. But the prenup was quietly rewritten, this time by an attorney I chose myself, protecting both of us equally, the way any fair agreement always should have from the start. 12 moments. 2 lives running in parallel for over 2 years without either family fully seeing the whole picture. 1 folder that, in the end, said far more about the people who never once thought to open it than it ever said about me. If you made it all the way here, tell me in the comments which of the 12 turning points changed the story the most for you. And if you want to know what actually happened at the wedding 6 months later, once everyone at that table had to sit across from each other again, let me know, because that dinner still wasn't the last surprise in this story.